here with the president of the J.D. Davison fan club. That's Ben DuBose. You know him well, USA Today, and writes for ClutchFans as well. Ben, Rockets complete the sweep of the preseason 4-0, and we're on to the regular season. What were your thoughts tonight? Obviously, several players sat out. I mean, we're talking about 7 guys, key guys, Capella, Adams, all the way down to the starters. We saw basically Reed Sheppard tonight, and he played really, really well. What were your thoughts?
Well, let's not bury the lead. The highlight was clearly the J.D. Davison facial in the fourth quarter. No, I'm kidding. The storyline was obviously Reed Sheppard, because he went up there basically with maybe one other rotation player in Josh Okogie, and Okogie's a fringe rotation player, 9th or 10th on your depth chart, against a Hawks team that not only started Trae Young at point guard, a perennial all-star in the Eastern Conference, but played most of its regulars. I mean, Kristaps Porzingis put up 23 and 13, and I want to say like 28 minutes. I mean, the Hawks took this game, at least from a rotation standpoint, pretty seriously. And Quinn Snyder's a good coach, and the Rockets just outclassed them. And Reed Sheppard leading the way, certainly statistically, but I think to see Reed have that type of game when he had the freedom, that's what I keep going back to. His post-game interview with Vanessa Richardson, 5 words stood out to me: go out and play free. And of course, he's talking about the green light he had tonight because the Rockets only had 8 players. They rested most of their big guys because it's the final game of the preseason. I guess it didn't really matter to Ime Udoka that a 4-0 preseason record was on the line, but they ended up getting it anyway, in large part due to Reed Sheppard. And I just think, you combine what we saw from Reed tonight with the games he started last year, when even as a rookie, even with his flaws, he averaged 20 points and 5 assists per game on good efficiency. And I think it's pretty clear when Reed has a green light, he's going to put up numbers. He's a good player. He got a ton of steals. I think 6 tonight? Do you have the box in front of you?
I do have the box in front of me. I had 4, but maybe he picked up a couple at the end.
I thought he did.
4 steals, 3 blocks.
Okay. Well, maybe I'm conflating the steals and the blocks, but yeah, the point is he makes plays on both ends. Sure, he's a little small. He's going to get beaten from time to time, and he's going to get in foul trouble against some bigger guards, but he's also going to make some home run type plays as well. And the hope is that those offset. And when he plays with freedom, he's a really good player. Now, how does it contribute to winning? How can you put an entire team around him? I don't know, but you don't have to have the answers at 21 years old. I think the bigger takeaway here, I saw so many off-season draft reviews of the 2024 draft class where these experts dropped Reed to 7th or 8th, something like that, in a redraft. And I think that's absolutely silly because the guys that are being moved ahead of him, for the most part, are putting up volume stats on mediocre to bad teams. I don't want this to come across as, criticism of Stephon Castle, who was a deserving Rookie of the Year winner for the Spurs last year. He put up big numbers on his Spurs team that won 30 games, played half the year without Victor Wembanyama, and had basically an unlimited green light. We still don't know how he's going to produce in the context of a winning team and how it's all going to translate. He's still figuring it out. And so Reed not playing much, the limited numbers that we saw, this was a winning team where there are actual expectations. And so it's too soon to say exactly what he's going to be in the future. I'm not trying to take a victory lap. But what I do think we can say confidently is that if Reed was drafted into the normal situation that a top 3 pick in the draft would be, I think we're having an entirely different conversation about Reed Sheppard as an NBA player. Because I think if he would have played 25 to 30 minutes per game last year and had a green light, he puts up big numbers and people look at him as maybe a star in the making. We're having a different conversation simply because of the team he was drafted to. And again, way too soon to take a victory lap. This is the preseason. All those caveats are completely valid. But this is also why you shouldn't be too despondent by his numbers or lack thereof as a rookie. No, he's still developing. And if you put him on another team where he had a green light, he'd put up big numbers all the time. And obviously, the question in Houston is going to be, how does that translate to a smaller role? Because especially with his archetype, there's going to be some nights where he misses his first 3 or 4 shots. And if he's a backup playing only 12 to 15 minutes, he's not going to want to risk tanking the game by himself, going 1 of 9, 1 of 10, something like that. So he might get a little bit timid. That was an issue, I thought, when he was a backup point guard last year as a rookie. He's improved some between year 1 and year 2. The Rockets have both publicly and privately behind the scenes, been extremely positive about his offseason for months. So some of it could be physical improvements, but I also think there's a mental side that, it is delicate for him to sort of find the right balance between that go out and play free mantra that he had tonight and the discipline that comes with being a rotation player that might be on a tighter leash, only playing 15 to 20 minutes. So again, all valid questions, no victory laps. But what I will say, this is proof of concept. There is no reason why. If you were excited about Reed Sheppard when the Rockets drafted him in June of 2024, there is no reason for you to be less excited about him today. The reasons he hasn't put up numbers, the reasons he hasn't played relative to the other young guys in the draft class are simply because of how rare the Houston situation is picking that high in the draft. And so however you felt about Reed last summer, you should still feel at least that good today, in my opinion. And today was proof of concept for that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you and I hadn't actually discussed, we just went cold into this and hadn't exchanged thoughts. But one of the things I had actually written down was, it's clear to me if Reed had been drafted in the early Silas era team, that he'd be putting up numbers. Now, today was the best he's looked since late last season, as far as what we've seen. Just for whatever reason, it's been a mixed bag the first 3 preseason games. And Summer League, you can throw it out, but he didn't play particularly well in Summer League, or didn't thrive like we had hoped he would.
Although it was only like a game and a quarter or a game and 3 quarters, so a little bit of a sample size issue there, but fair.
Exactly. It wasn't much. But I think it's very clear that if he had been on those Silas era teams, like your, Jalen, Şengün, Jabari, you get drafted, you play big minutes, he'd be putting up numbers without question. We saw this last year, OKC, when the Rockets rested those guys down the stretch. He played really well. He's done this consistently when he's been given, as you said, free reign. So yeah, it's a different story if he gets drafted by a lottery team and you just throw him out there to play. There are things nits to pick with Reed Sheppard, but today he played exceptionally well. I'm not saying he is this player, because anytime you throw a name out there, people will take the whole thing. But just when I watched him defensively, just with his hands and the way he kind of stripped the basketball out there pretty consistently, was in the passing lanes, it just reminds me a lot of John Stockton. And I'm old, back when I used to watch Stockton, just being sort of the undersized, a little bit shorter arms, but quick, and just basically got his hand on the basketball quite a bit today. As you pointed out, 4 steals, 3 blocks, and had some really, highlight reel plays. I mean, the strip of Trey and then go the other way and hit the triple. He just, like I said, there's plenty of things that you can look at with Reed that he's going to have to grow. Like, just the on-ball defense with his size. Just, teams are going to challenge him and they're going to test him in his second year. But offensively, if he's given the green light, he's already a shooter, in my opinion, on the level, at least as far as what you're looking at with a Trey or a Steph Curry. And I'm not saying he's Steph, but he can shoot those shots. If he gets, 5 feet beyond the 3-point line and you give him the green light, he can put up points in a hurry. So it's interesting because this is, I don't know if he's going to start in this next game. I don't think he will, but you're talking about your 7th, 8th guy right now on this team, and he looks really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it was noteworthy that in both halves, he actually got off to a slow start. I don't have the box right in front of me, but I think it was 0 of 3, 0 of 4, something like that.
Yeah, I thought he was 1 for 3 today, and then he hit 7 of his next game.
Yeah, in both halves, he sort of got himself going. In the first half, there were a couple of middies that he hit in quick succession, and then before you knew it, it was one of those explosions like we saw in the Summer League game against the Clippers in the second half, where he puts up shots from distance so quickly that all it takes is a good 2 or 3 minute stretch, and you blink, and the stat line overall is just ridiculously good. And so the challenge is going to be, if he's not playing 25, 30 minutes, and even if he does play mid-20s minutes, the green light he has playing alongside Houston Rockets starting level players, not the group tonight. No disrespect to those who were out there and played well, but for the most part, this was the Ime Udoka culture show. When you look at, and his guys did come in and make threes, but Isaiah Crawford, Cameron Matthews, Kevon Harris, those types, one little silver lining I would throw out there for all the concern about defense in the preseason, the Rockets are the type of team that, unlike most NBA teams that suffer defensively over the grind of 82 games because inevitably some guys get hurt, actually the Rockets might be a little bit better as they go through the grind, because inevitably when guys need time off or get hurt, then there's a clear type at the end of that bench. The two-way guys, but also Jayshawn Tate, Dorian Finney-Smith, those guys are going to be back in the relatively near future. And so the further down you go the bench, they all play really well defensively. So they're certainly going to hold up on that end. And then if they hit threes the way the Rockets did tonight, I think, 19 overall?
I did not actually note the number of threes they hit to 19 of 48. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, they were making it volume. And so that makes it all the easier for Reed to do his thing. And, Reed's always going to be a guy, at least at this point in his career. Now, maybe, as the years progress, he sort of develops the way actually Fred did the last few years, gets thicker and more physical. But for now, you're going to have to hope that Reed individually, he's going to get beaten sometimes, but that he has, the instincts, the quick hands to, make enough plays to offset the lowlights, if you will. But another big part of it is you just have to hope that the other players, the other four guys that are out there with them, can help make up for some of those deficiencies. And that was one thing tonight, even with it being the end of the bench guys, well, they can all play really good defense. And so that made it easier for sort of Reed to just hone in on doing what he does best and letting the other guys, if there are any messes to clean up, they have the ability to do that. I think, this was an Ime Udoka culture game. And in that context, for a team that last year had clear offensive deficiencies, Reed's sort of the perfect guy to bring along and increasingly take on a bigger role as the years progress. I mean, in the short term, you have Kevin Durant, but in some ways, Kevin Durant is a short-term stimulus. He's something to take you to that next level now and to get this team from, mediocre to good offensively, hopefully mediocre to great, but time will tell on that. But then in the long run, and we're talking, 3, 4, 5 years out, can the Rockets sustain themselves at a championship contending level? Yeah, Reed continuing to develop and getting to at least being a very good NBA player, and perhaps more than that. You threw out Steph Curry, and that's probably a little ambitious, but, inside the building, I will say, like, they've thrown out some pretty high-level targets, not saying that they know he'll become that, but that it's certainly not implausible. And even if it's, 70, 80% of a guy like that, that's still a really freaking good player. So long-term, he's so important. You have to figure out how to offset, some of the defensive deficiencies. Not all of it's actually, most of it isn't, a lack of effort. It's just sort of occupational, given his size, body type, those types of things. And yeah, I mean, this was really encouraging. The fact that it obviously came in a winning context. It wasn't like he was just, chucking and putting up stats, but the Rockets were giving up tons of points and losing. No, they were undermanned on paper, and they beat the Hawks with Reed putting up big numbers. I mean, I don't see how he could have done more. Like, when you go into the game and ask, what can be expected of Reed Sheppard, this checked every conceivable box. And my gut tells me it'll still be Steven Adams starting in Oklahoma City, if you want to sort of transition our discussion to that, because as long as Chet and Hartenstein are both available, I tend to think they'll go double big. Tuesday was the closest thing to a dress rehearsal, and as we talked about on our postgame show, Steven was like plus 26 in 24 minutes. So I still think Steven, at least given the matchup to start the year, is going to be the front runner. But I tell you what, like, Reed should definitely be playing at least 20 minutes per game off the bench, and when the matchups are right, he's proven that this is not Reed Sheppard in the rotation as a developmental thing. No, Reed Sheppard is in the rotation because he is ready to be a good NBA player this season. And whether that's a starter, whether it's a part-time starter, whether it's coming off the bench, I think we've seen enough through the preseason to conclude that. And by the way, if you go back, one last thing I would point out, if you look at the preseason stats overall, which Reed's been very efficient for this year as a whole. Last year, he shot just 22% from three. I'm pulling this up right now. The 24. So even if you want to talk about it's the preseason, apples to apples. Yeah, last year in the preseason, he averaged 6.5 points per game, 44% shooting, and actually 18% from three. So yeah, even if we want to do the whole apples to apples, it's the preseason, how hard are these guys going? Well, even if we adjust for that, what Reed showed you this preseason is different, not just tonight, the totality of his level of play, and it justifies the hype that the Rockets have put on him all offseason.
Yeah, and we talked about this after the first game. And we were saying that in the context of, well, Reed wasn't looking amazing, but the Rockets just they rave about him. I would say Amen and Reed, behind the scenes, are the two guys that when they drafted them, I'm not talking about just throughout the season, no knock on any of their player, but when they drafted them, the excitement level was just enormous. Like they just really believe in Reed Sheppard. And we've seen flashes here and there, but we haven't really seen what they, it hasn't risen to the level of the praise that they have given him. And tonight you see what they see. So there's tremendous potential in Reed Sheppard. If he is a point guard and, he showed some of that tonight, there's a tremendous value in him. Defensively, we can talk about that another day. But he off ball, he's been really good there. But offensively, Reed Sheppard has just looked fantastic tonight. And I was impressed.
And post-game quote from Ime Udoka via Daniel Lerner of the Chronicle. Ime said the Rockets starting lineup might be fluid game to game to start the season, or at least until everyone is healthy. Dave, I read that as a huge endorsement of Reed, that he's pushed himself into that conversation. Because Steven Adams, we talked about the other day, the floor is really high. And I think it's pretty clear that the Rockets don't want to start Tari Eason. The only preseason game that Tari started was that opener when KD sat out. So when we talk about the uncertainty with the starting lineup, I think it's the wildly different archetypes of Reed as a point guard versus Steven Adams as a center and running the double big. And the fact that Reed has shown enough to where that's a viable conversation to be had. I mean, the Rockets think the world of Steven Adams. We know this, and deservedly so. He's a very, very good player. So the fact that Reed has pushed this to where it is a legitimate topic, even if we both think that Steven's probably going to start in Oklahoma City based on the matchup, simply the Rockets being willing, and Ime said going into training camp, in a perfect world, yeah, he'd like to allow guys to get, consistency of role. The fact that he's willing to be fluid, that he's seen enough to where it's going to remain open-ended, and maybe part of this is buying time until Dorian Finney-Smith comes back, and perhaps if the defense needs a boost, then maybe that's the play. But the fact that Reed has done enough that this is a conversation, I think speaks volumes of just how the 2025 preseason is different than his preseason a year ago.
And I think we know, at least front office, and I think it extends to Ime as well, that's what they want eventually. When eventually is, I don't know. I mean, when Fred was here, they still thought that would be in the future, but they believed he was going to eventually take that torch from Fred, probably midseason or end of the year. And we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. So, yeah, I agree with you. That is a strong endorsement.
Although one other thing I should point out, he had really good chemistry tonight with Josh Okogie. So that's one other thing to keep in mind. If you're playing Okogie off the bench, and I think it's pretty clear, as much as I love J.D. Davison, Okogie is ahead of him. He's more proven, especially on defense, which is what Ime values. So if those are the 8th and 9th, 9th and 10th, whatever the case may be, guys off the bench, then the synergies that those two have together may be something to keep in mind, especially if Aaron Holiday gets phased out, because if you play Reed more, then Aaron Holiday's lack of size might be a little bit of a deficiency. Well, the fact you can turn to Josh Okogie, who had a big night, and the fact that defensively he's big enough and dynamic enough that he can offset some of the physical limitations with Reed, that's a little thing to keep in mind as well.
Let's talk a little bit about Tari, and then we can talk about the season coming up. It's on deck, obviously, Tuesday in OKC. But Tari Eason is still without an extension. We did see Keegan Murray sign an extension, actually signed for more than Jabari Smith Jr., which to me suggests that Jabari's the bargain. I personally would rather have Jabari Smith Jr. than Keegan Murray. Some people may disagree. I think I'd much rather have Jabari. But
Same.
To me, Tari Eason is, he did not seem super thrilled. I don't want to read too much into it at media day. Just certainly believes he wants more respect. I don't know if that extends into the negotiations necessarily, but still without a contract. If he doesn't sign an extension, he will become a restricted free agent at the end of this year. Where do you think they are right now with this?
Yeah, the last that we've seen as far as the reporting that's out there is that both sides were hopeful. I still think it's slightly more likely than not that a deal gets done, but it's close. Like I'm 51-49 right now that a deal gets done. I just think this one is so hard to project because both sides have added risk. Obviously, with the Rockets, they have to account for the leg injuries the last 2 years. With Tari, to some extent, it comes down to, is he willing to sort of sell low, which is what he would be doing if he signs a deal right now, going in when he has less leverage as opposed to playing out a season. And if he's healthy, able to play back-to-backs, maybe he plays better in the playoffs, which was an issue a year ago, then in theory, he'd be in a better bargaining position next summer. Now, maybe that's offset by how cold restricted free agency can be. We saw that with Jonathan Kuminga and Josh Giddey and the other guys that went, Cam Thomas in Brooklyn, a prime example of that, that went the RFA route this summer. It's tough to project because, I think in a perfect world, both sides would wait until 26 because there's a lot of uncertainty. The Rockets could feel better about their investment. Tari could feel better that he's not, selling at a low point, that he's actually going to them and trying to sell himself when his market value is high. But there's certainly value and stability for Tari. He's had those issues that might prompt him to want the security. And from a Rocket standpoint, look, we know they want to lock in those future figures as soon as possible because they're concerned about not the luxury tax, but the first and second aprons and everything that comes from, keeping a contending team together in the NBA and how challenging it is under the current CBA. So both sides, there's reasons to wait and there's also reasons to get it done early. And if you take Tari's words at face value, his stuff about wanting more minutes and more opportunities, then that might tip you towards believing that he's okay with waiting. But I still tend to think there's some posturing there. I agree with you. You can't necessarily take those at face value, or at least not in the context of negotiations. And so even though you can read those, and if you squint hard enough, think he's, from the Fred VanVleet tree of bet on yourself, I don't know. I still tend to think the leaks that both sides were hopeful were there for a reason. And I also think what pushes me over the edge of thinking a deal gets done, well, there are two things. The biggest reason, there's been all this optimism about a Kevin Durant extension. Kevin's basically said he sees himself extending here. The Rockets obviously want to keep him around. He's still an all-star. There's a reason you make the trade, yet a deal hasn't gotten done. And certainly Kevin's a guy who's had plenty of injuries. So why hasn't a deal gotten done? If Kevin wants it to get done, obviously the Rockets want to have him around. Kevin would love the security. The most plausible reason that a Kevin Durant extension hasn't gotten done is because there's basically an understanding of, let's see what the salary cap picture is after signing Tari Eason, and we'll give you whatever we have that's left over. Whatever we have that's left over in the context of, until you bump up against the first or second apron or whatever the case may be. So the fact that KD hasn't signed an extension yet makes me think that the Rockets are hopeful that something may be coming that gives them more clarity in the near future, because I don't think they want to wait on KD until next offseason. I think the Kevin deal is going to get done soon no matter what, and they have held off because they're hopeful that the Tari situation is going to come to a head in the coming days. So that's the biggest piece that tells me that the Rockets are still hopeful they can get something done here. The other piece, and this is a small one, but whether you sign Tari now or next offseason, it has a lot to do with whether he can be included in trades. Because if you sign him now, it's basically the poison pill year, because he counts what his outgoing salary is different than the incoming salary. And so it's very different. It's very difficult for the math to work on a deal. We saw this with Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün last year. But the flip side is, if you do a deal now, he is fully eligible to be traded next offseason, just as we saw with Jalen Green. The reason Jalen Green could be used as a centerpiece of the Kevin Durant trade, because you did the extension before last offseason. If you hadn't done that, Jalen couldn't have been in the deal without his consent, because he'd be a restricted free agent. So it sort of comes down to, if you think you need a bigger trade, and, Giannis is at the top of the list, but there's obviously others, well below that. But do you think you might need Tari as a trade piece at the 2026 deadline or in the 2026 offseason? That's the debate. I kind of lean towards the 26 offseason, which would tip the scales towards doing a deal now, so these trade eligible next offseason, not an RFA, simply because most big names, most notably Kevin this past offseason, the really big names, it seems like they wait these days until the offseason to force a move. You haven't seen that many huge names get dealt at the trade deadline. Perhaps Jimmy Butler is the one guy the last couple of years, and Jimmy had some baggage and is in his mid-30s. So if Giannis or someone like that comes available, I tend to think it'd be more the 26 off season rather than the deadline. And so that might tip you a little bit towards doing a deal now as well. I do think it's interesting what a deal might look like. ESPN.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
They had Bobby Marks and Tim Bon. They had ESPN's Bobby Marks and Tim Bontemps do an article that posted earlier today, looking at the numbers, and they did the pros and cons for all the, the 2022 first round picks that are extension eligible. And the deal they threw out for Tari was 4 years, $80 million. That's 20 in average annual value, which, I think is reasonable. It's above the MLE, but not a crazy number. I think it could fit within the long-term puzzle. You could make that work. Anything above 20 for a bench player gets a little high, and that's something that Bobby Marks was pointing out. I actually wonder, and this is not sourced, I could actually see this being a shorter deal than that, simply because of all the risk. I could see it sort of being like the Jalen Green deal, where it's 2 or 3 years. Maybe there's an option in there. Maybe it's like 3 for 65. You give a slight bit more in average annual value, but fewer guaranteed years. And then you sort of have the best of both worlds, in that if you're Tari, you get some financial security. But if it turns out that, you are capable of a bigger role and you take advantage of these more minutes, then you get your next contract sooner. And so you could potentially get more money overall. And from a Rocket standpoint, you protect yourself some from the injury risk. We know what's going on with his leg the last 2 years, because you're not on the books for, 4 or 5 years out. So that's where I tend to think this goes. I don't think this is like Jabari. I've seen some say, well, Tari to this point has been a better player than Jabari. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I mean, if you squint hard enough and you look at strictly the per minute numbers and the efficiency, you can make the argument, but you have to consider certainly the injury risk, the availability, and also how does it translate to the playoffs? Let's be blunt. Jabari was a very good player in the playoffs. Tari was not. So I think saying Tari is better than Jabari is a stretch. I've seen some argue that and say, well, Jabari got, 5 for 120, so Tari should be at least at that ballpark. Well, I don't think he's going to get 5 years based on the injury risk. And secondly, if he really does believe that, I don't know that it behooves him to settle for a deal in that tier if he thinks he can play his way into something bigger. So I tend to think this might be a little bit shorter. Bobby proposed 4 for 80. I could see 3 for 60, 3 for 55, 3 for 65, something in that ballpark. Maybe there's a team option, something that there's a little closer to Jalen Green than it is to Jabari or Alperen Şengün in terms of sort of the Rockets extension templates. Yeah. Because I just think Tari's got a fairly unique risk profile that, not saying he's the same player as Jalen Green, but I do think there's some similar, risk versus reward, boom versus bust considerations to have.
Yeah, I think you touched on what I've been kind of wondering is, did the Jabari extension so early cause any problems? And again, I'm speculating here. I haven't heard that. But I just think, you touched on it already, but he may think to himself, hey, in the last 3 years, I've basically outproduced Jabari. Jabari is definitely a future potential. He's younger than Tari. Tari was more plug and play for what he does. His strengths were ready out of the box. And I think that, certainly could play a role. I think if it's 16 to 18 million, annual value, I think you'd be loving it. It's a bargain. It's probably going to be more like 19 to 21, which would be reasonable. I'm sure he wants something closer to Jabari as far as annual value. That's just my guess. We'll see how this plays out, but he has to look at it as well. Like, he has this leg issue. It has caused some problems, hasn't been able to play back to backs. That to me is a give or take. And I think you basically broke it down nicely in the sense that this might be something where he takes what he can get now in a shorter window and he can revisit this down the line. But yeah, they have until 5:00, I believe, is that Eastern on Tuesday?
No, it's 5:00 Central on Monday, because it's one
Monday.
day before the regular season opener. And spoiler alert, Dave and I have talked offline, but I think the idea is, we'll pop in and do one of these live shortly after the deadline, because one way or another, there's going to be stuff to talk about along with the preview of the Rockets Thunder regular season opener the next night.
Absolutely. And as you just pointed out, Rockets do open the season in OKC on Tuesday. We think, and you highlighted it last game, that we'll probably see the double big starting. They really did well against OKC, and we'll talk more about that game on Monday. But I do want to point out, Şengün has had his way with Chet. Chet has been fine on the other end. He's been hitting threes, but he can't defend Şengün. So I do expect the Thunder to adjust some way, because Chet just doesn't have the sand in his pants, to pull an old reference, to body up with Şengün. You need to defend Şengün. You need a strong body, somebody who can keep him outside of 5 feet from the basket. And that's not Chet. and they would normally use Hartenstein in that role, but then Chet's not going to keep Adams from feasting on the offensive glass either. So they have a problem there. I'm going to be very curious to see if Dort or Cason Wallace actually defends Şengün. That seems maybe like, he would feast, but we've seen some guys, I look at Grant Williams in the past, have success against defending Şengün just by literally just keeping him away from the basket. I'm going to see what OKC does to adjust, but they will be one man down, most likely. Jalen Williams will be out for that game. At least it looks like he's dealing with recovering from wrist surgery and has not been able to shoot with that hand yet. So Rockets should have a good opportunity there to take that game. But that's going to be the most fascinating thing to me. This is the championship, the team that won it last year, and the Rockets have, they've been hit or miss with them, but they're the team to beat in the West. Do the Rockets legitimately have something that they cannot handle? And what does OKC do to adjust?
Yeah, especially if Jalen Williams is out, this is a really good time to sort of show that you're on that tier, because it's not like the Rockets are at full strength themselves. Obviously, there's no Dorian Finney-Smith.
Right.
Fred VanVleet's probably out for the year, but the Rockets aren't ruling him out by any stretch. So it's not like the Rockets are at full strength. And if anything, the Rockets are the team that has more upward mobility because they're still integrating Kevin Durant, whereas the Thunder are bringing back largely the team they had last season. So if Jalen Williams is out, it's not as simple as saying, well, the Rockets are a finished product and the Thunder are going to get better. No, if the Rockets can go in there in Oklahoma City on a rig night and compete, let alone win, even if this is a close game in the final minutes, then you have to feel really good about this team. And, you mentioned Şengün. The two guys I'm actually looking at the most closely are Kevin and Jabari. Kevin because of the obvious OKC storyline, but I also think if there's no Jalen Williams, then the Thunder are going to have to try smaller guys at the 2 and the 3 more often. You mentioned Cason Wallace. I think you'd see Alex Caruso play more. And these are guys that, while very good defensively, if you're 6'11" and have a high launch point and can shoot very well, you can just shoot over a lot of these guys. And so to me, this is prime for a matchup where if the Thunder go with their most agile lineup that's, best defensively on paper, the Rockets are going to have a size advantage. And, it's easy to think of that in terms of the bigs, Şengün and Steven Adams. But I actually think you'll notice it more on the wing, because I think you'll see Kevin and Jabari get some matchups where they have a pretty clear height advantage. And if they're making their shots, if they can just rise and fire over guys, then yeah, I agree with you. The Rockets should have a real chance, especially because, I think to start the game, clearly it'll be a men on SGA. But I thought last year, if you go back and look at, especially early in the year when the Rockets were fully healthy, it was actually Tari Eason, when the chips were down, that the Rockets trusted as their SGA defender at the point of attack. That's how good Tari can be when he's right. Clearly, they think that SGA is a good matchup for him. And so if you can have Tari do some of the heavy lifting against SGA, let him in, save some of his juice for the offensive end of the floor, to me, that's sort of the perfect tag team to, you're not going to shut him down by any stretch, but just keep his productivity within reason, not insane efficiency, to where hopefully the Rockets have enough on the other end to win out.
That's going to be Tuesday. Well, as you pointed out, we'll probably do a live show on Monday and talk a little bit about, the Tari extension, hopefully, or the decision to not extend him. And then we'll gear up for the games. I'm excited. I'm really pumped up about the year. They're all going to matter from here on out. I mean, today's game was fun to watch what Reed Sheppard can do, but kind of pointless in the grand scheme watching, Crawford and these guys, no disrespect to them, just knowing that they're not going to be playing in the games that matter, really. So I'm really looking forward to, this chess match that's going to start Tuesday night against OKC.
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
Ben,
and then Monday, either way, I hope an extension gets done, but even if it doesn't, then that sort of gives you a tell as to what the future might look like, what the options are in terms of the trade market. If a deal doesn't get done, he's more eligible to get dealt during this upcoming season. So there could be some new implications there. So bottom line, Monday, one way or another, I think we're going to have something to talk about.
Absolutely. Ben, appreciate you doing this. Rockets finished the preseason 4-0 to open the season against the world champs OKC on Tuesday. Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a great night.